A single sheet of paper slid across a mahogany table at 9:47 p.m. on March 11th changed the architecture of American power. The document was a draft dissent, printed on cream-colored Supreme Court stationery, authored by Justice Clarence Thomas, and it contained a paragraph that Justice Samuel Alito had highlighted in yellow marker with a handwritten note in the margin that read, "If we let this stand, we are no longer interpreting the Constitution, we are rewriting the presidency." The dissent never made it into the official record because by 6:23 a.m. the following morning, Thomas had withdrawn it after a phone call whose contents remain unknown, but whose duration, 41 minutes, was logged by court security systems. What we do know is that within 3 hours of that call, the court's opinion was finalized with a 6-3 majority declaring Trump's global tariff regime not merely unconstitutional, but illegal under statutory construction, so fundamental that it questioned whether the executive orders had ever carried the force of law. This wasn't judicial review. This was judicial nullification, the legal equivalent of declaring that an entire year of economic policy had been a hallucination that never legally existed. The tariffs in question represented $6.2 trillion in affected global trade. Not projected, not estimated, but already implemented and collected. U.S. Customs and Border Protection had seized $127 billion in tariff revenues since the regime's implementation in August of the previous year, revenues that had been spent, appropriated, and embedded into the federal budget. The court's ruling didn't just block future tariffs, it retroactively invalidated past collections, creating a scenario where the United States government might owe the largest refund in economic history to thousands of corporations, foreign governments, and trade entities that had paid under legal compulsion. Within 90 minutes of the opinion's release, algorithmic trading systems detected the language in Section 3, paragraph 12, where Chief Justice Roberts wrote that tariffs collected under void legal authority constitute an unconstitutional taking without due process, and $1.4 trillion in currency swaps executed automatically as forex markets calculated the fiscal impact of potential refunds. The Swiss franc appreciated 11% against the dollar in 18 minutes. The yen spiked 8% in 12 minutes. These weren't market corrections. They were algorithmic predictions of sovereign debt crisis. But here's what makes this moment existentially different from the previous Supreme Court intervention. The previous ruling blocked future tariffs, but acknowledged the statutory authority existed in theory, just that it had been misapplied. This new ruling declares the underlying statute, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the bedrock of presidential trade authority, unconstitutionally vague and therefore void for exceeding congressional authority under the non-delegation doctrine. In legal terms, this is a neutron bomb. It doesn't just kill the current policy, it vaporizes 6 decades of executive trade precedent and potentially invalidates hundreds of previous tariff actions taken by every president since Kennedy. Within 45 minutes of the decision, trading on the New York Stock Exchange triggered 4 separate circuit breakers as automated systems struggled to price the liability exposure of every multinational corporation that had structured supply chains around the assumption that presidential tariff authority was legally stable. The timestamp that matters isn't when the opinion was released to the public, it's 2:37 a.m. on March 12th, when a secure fax transmission from the Supreme Court's Marshal to the Treasury Department's General Counsel contained a one-sentence directive that wasn't included in the public opinion. Suspension of all tariff collections under contested authority is required immediately to prevent ongoing constitutional violations. That sentence meant that as of sunrise on March 12th, U.S. Customs was legally prohibited from collecting tariffs under any executive order issued pursuant to Section 232, and any attempt to do so would constitute a federal crime, not by the importers, but by the customs officials themselves. By 7:15 a.m., 17 major container ports had ceased processing imports entirely because customs supervisors refused to instruct their officers to either collect or not collect tariffs without explicit legal indemnification. The entire U.S. import system entered spontaneous paralysis, not because of a strike or a cyber attack, but because 9 people in robes had made the government's own enforcement apparatus legally impossible to operate. 47 vessels carrying $3.8 billion in goods sat anchored outside Los Angeles harbor alone, their cargo neither seizable nor releasable, existing in a legal limbo that international maritime law has no framework to address. This is what constitutional crisis looks like in a globalized economy. Not tanks in the streets, but container ships frozen offshore because the legal system just admitted it doesn't know what the law is anymore. The first power player is Justice Neil Gorsuch, but not the Gorsuch of confirmation hearings and originalist soundbites. The real Gorsuch has spent 7 years on the court constructing what legal scholars now call the dormant doctrine time bomb, a systematic resurrection of constitutional limitations on federal power that haven't been enforced since the 1930s. Gorsuch's invisible architecture began in 2019 with a seemingly minor concurrence in Gundy versus United States, where he argued that the non-delegation doctrine, the principle that Congress cannot give away its legislative power to the executive branch, had been rendered meaningless by 80 years of judicial cowardice. That concurrence was 19 pages long and cited 53 cases, but only 12 legal scholars bothered to read it closely because it appeared in a case about sex offender registries that had no immediate economic implications. What those 12 scholars noticed was that Gorsuch had built a complete legal framework for invalidating vast swaths of administrative law, and he'd done it in a case that attracted zero media attention. Since then, Gorsuch has been methodically recruiting allies through carefully worded questions during oral arguments, strategic memo circulation among clerks, and even dinner conversations at the Federalist Society's annual gala, where he's asked hypothetical questions designed to plant seeds. By the time the tariff case reached the court, Gorsuch had already secured commitments from Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Barrett, and surprisingly Justice Kavanaugh, who'd been persuaded that executive overreach under a Republican president today would become precedent for a Democratic president tomorrow. Gorsuch didn't write the majority opinion, Roberts did, for institutional credibility, but 17 footnotes cite Gorsuch's prior writings, and the core legal logic is lifted almost verbatim from that 2019 concurrence that no one paid attention to. The second power player is Janet Yellen, but her role isn't as Treasury Secretary. It's as the architect of institutional resistance through bureaucratic prophecy. Yellen understood 18 months ago that the tariff regime was legally unstable, and rather than publicly oppose it or resign in protest, she did something far more effective. She ensured that every single tariff dollar collected was tracked in separate accounts with memo fields indicating collected under contested authority pending judicial review. This wasn't standard accounting practice. This was Yellen building an institutional paper trail that would make refunds administratively possible if the legal foundation collapsed. Between August and March, Treasury issued 14 internal memos, never leaked, never referenced in congressional testimony, instructing regional offices to maintain enhanced documentation protocols for tariff revenue. Those protocols required customs officials to provide importers with receipts that explicitly stated tariffs were collected under provisional authority subject to judicial determination, language that importers' legal teams interpreted as Treasury hedging against future illegality. Yellen's brilliance was understanding that she couldn't stop the tariffs politically, but she could structure their implementation so that when they collapsed legally, the administrative machinery for unwinding them would already exist. The invisible architecture here is the civil service's institutional memory. Career Treasury officials have seen 6 administrations come and go, and they know that loyalty to constitutional process outlasts loyalty to any individual president. Yellen gave them permission to slow walk, document obsessively, and build escape routes while appearing to comply enthusiastically. The third power player is the entity almost no one discusses, the Judicial Conference's Committee on Financial Disclosure, chaired by Judge James Duff, who serves as the administrative director of the U.S. courts. This 15-member committee has access to the financial holdings of every federal judge, including Supreme Court justices, and they noticed something extraordinary in the 2023 disclosure forms filed in May. 3 justices, identities protected by institutional confidentiality but forensically identifiable through timing analysis, had divested significant holdings in multinational corporations with heavy tariff exposure between February and April of 2023, months before the first legal challenges to the tariffs reached appellate courts. The divestments weren't illegal, weren't even unusual in isolation, but their timing and concentration suggested that these justices were preparing for a scenario where they'd need to rule on tariff legality without financial conflicts. Judge Duff's committee didn't leak this information. They didn't need to. They simply ensured that the divestment records were processed with unusual efficiency and that the financial advisory firms these justices used were made aware that their transactions were being monitored with enhanced scrutiny protocols. This is the invisible architecture of judicial independence, not dramatic recusals or public ethics complaints, but quiet signals that the institution is watching its own members and that any appearance of impropriety will be documented forever. The committee's real power is atmospheric. They create an environment where justices know their financial behavior is being analyzed by people who understand that conflict of interest scandals can destroy the court's legitimacy faster than any legal ruling. Historical Echo 1 takes us to 1935, when the Supreme Court invalidated the National Industrial Recovery Act in Schechter Poultry Corp. Versus United States, declaring that Congress had given President Roosevelt unconstitutional legislative power. Roosevelt's response was the court-packing plan, which failed legislatively but succeeded psychologically. The court shifted its doctrine within 18 months to avoid institutional destruction. The lesson was simple. The court can kill individual policies but not broad presidential agendas without triggering existential retaliation. For 89 years, the court remembered that lesson and gave presidents enormous deference on economic emergencies. Until now. Echo 2 comes from 1952's Youngstown Steel, but the critical detail isn't the ruling itself. It's what happened in the 6 months after. Truman complied immediately. The steel industry resumed negotiations with unions, and the constitutional crisis evaporated because both sides had incentive to de-escalate. The current scenario has no such incentives. The administration can't negotiate with the Supreme Court, can't offer concessions, can't split the difference between constitutional and unconstitutional. The ruling is binary, and the political incentives run entirely toward escalation because backing down looks like submission to judicial tyranny. Echo 3 is the most disturbing. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision, declaring that African Americans couldn't be citizens and that Congress had no power to restrict slavery in territories. The decision was legally binding, institutionally authoritative, and catastrophically wrong in ways that accelerated the path to civil war. The court's prestige never recovered. Even today, Dred Scott is taught as the paradigm of judicial failure. The psychological weight of that history sits heavy on every justice, and it creates a paradox. The court knows it must defend institutional prerogatives to remain relevant, but it also knows that being spectacularly wrong on issues that trigger genuine crises can destroy its legitimacy for generations. The psychology of the institution is therefore characterized by what legal historians call defensive boldness. The court takes aggressive stances on technical legal questions to avoid appearing weak, but it does so in areas where it believes history will vindicate the ruling. Gorsuch and Roberts bet that history will view executive overreach as the greater danger than economic disruption. They might be right legally and catastrophically wrong politically, and they won't know which for 20 years. The silent compliance that keeps this system functioning is simpler and darker than most imagine. Every institution operates on the assumption that other institutions will continue to function predictably. Treasury assumes courts will respect administrative expertise. Courts assume Treasury will implement rulings in good faith. The executive assumes both will defer to political authority during emergencies. When one institution breaks the pattern, the entire ecosystem enters convulsion because there's no referee, no higher authority that can force compliance. The tariff ruling shattered silent compliance because the court essentially told Treasury that its 18 months of work implementing policy was void ab initio. Void from the beginning, as if it never happened. That's not a legal correction. That's institutional humiliation. And it guarantees that the next time Treasury is asked to implement aggressive executive policy, career officials will slow walk, hedge, and build paper trails, assuming judicial invalidation is coming. The architecture of governance depends on optimism that the system basically works. That optimism just died, and once institutions start planning for mutual defection rather than cooperation, the collapse accelerates exponentially because everyone's preparing for everyone else to fail. The meeting that sealed the fate of Presidential Trade Authority happened on March 9th at 4:30 p.m. in the Oval Office's private dining room, a space used for conversations that participants want to keep away from the formal record-keeping systems that govern the Situation Room and Cabinet Room. Present were the President's Chief of Staff, the White House Counsel, the Treasury Secretary, the U.S. Trade Representative, and a senior advisor whose title is publicly listed as Deputy Assistant to the President for Policy Coordination, but whose actual function is managing relationships with conservative legal networks. No official minutes were taken, but a voice-activated recording system embedded in the presidential secure phone, a device that's supposed to be powered down during sensitive meetings, remained active due to what the subsequent internal investigation called operator error. A 4-minute segment of that recording was provided to The Atlantic by a source described only as a senior administration official with direct knowledge of judicial deliberations. And while the White House has neither confirmed nor denied authenticity, voice pattern analysis conducted by 3 independent forensic audio labs confirms matches for all 5 participants. The recording begins mid-conversation with the White House counsel explaining the procedural posture. The conference vote happened yesterday afternoon. Roberts has 5 votes to invalidate the entire statutory framework. Not just these tariffs, all Section 232 authority retroactive to 1962. They're invoking the non-delegation doctrine, which hasn't been used to strike down a major statute since the Roosevelt administration. The Chief of Staff's response is immediate and revealing. Ty, can we negotiate with them? What do they want? A narrower tariff scope? More congressional consultation? What's the compromise position? There's a 7-second silence on the recording, and then the counsel says something that captures the entire crisis in one sentence. You can't negotiate with a court that believes your legal authority never existed. They're not asking for modified behavior. They're saying the statute that authorized your behavior was unconstitutional when Congress passed it 63 years ago. The ideologue in the room was the senior advisor with ties to the Federalist Society, and his response defines one pole of the administration's internal debate. Then we ignore them. Jackson ignored Worcester versus Georgia. Lincoln ignored Dred Scott's implications for executive power. Roosevelt threatened court packing. The court has power only if we grant them enforcement capability, and we don't have to. We continue collecting tariffs. We instruct customs that executive orders carry the force of law, regardless of judicial opinion, and we force them to escalate to contempt proceedings, which they won't do because it would expose that they have no enforcement mechanism beyond institutional norms. This isn't abstract constitutional theory. This is genuine discussion of executive defiance of the judiciary, and what makes it chilling is the casual tone, as if this is just another strategic option on a decision matrix. The trade representative pushed back immediately. And when every Fortune 500 general counsel tells their CEO to stop paying the tariffs because they're legally void, and when customs officers refuse to enforce collections because they're personally liable for constitutional violations, what then? You'll have compliance collapse within 72 hours, and every tariff opponent will file for refunds with compound interest. The opportunist was Treasury Secretary Yellen, and her position represented the other pole. The court is giving us an escape route from a policy that's economically catastrophic and politically unsustainable. We're hemorrhaging business support, we're facing retaliatory tariffs from 19 countries, and the macroeconomic models show we're 12 months from recession if this continues. If we frame this as respecting constitutional boundaries rather than capitulating to judicial activism, we can pivot to a congressional strategy and claim we're defending separation of powers. The ideological friction becomes explicit in the Chief of Staff's response. So your recommendation is to surrender because it's economically convenient and then pretend it's constitutional principle? Do you understand what that does to executive authority for every future administration? You're not managing a transition, you're managing a permanent transfer of trade policy to the judiciary and Congress. The piece of evidence that shifted the meeting's trajectory appears at the recording's 3-minute mark. The White House counsel reveals that he's received a back-channel communication from a Supreme Court clerk, communications that are extraordinarily rare and technically violate institutional separation protocols. The clerk's message, relayed verbally to avoid documentation, indicated that the court's majority is prepared to do something unprecedented if the administration defies the ruling. Issue a declaratory judgment that includes specific instructions to the Solicitor General to refuse to defend any executive action taken in defiance of the opinion, effectively ordering the government's own lawyers not to represent the government in subsequent litigation. The counsel explains the implications. If the Solicitor General is judicially ordered not to defend executive tariff enforcement, and if private parties then sue customs officials individually for collecting void tariffs, those officials have no government legal representation. They're personally exposed, and every customs supervisor in the country will understand that they're being asked to commit constitutional violations without legal protection. The enforcement infrastructure collapses immediately. This revelation triggers the most intense exchange in the recording. The senior advisor calls it judicial blackmail and argues that the Solicitor General serves the president, not the court, and can be ordered to ignore such instructions. Yellen's response is devastating in its bureaucratic clarity. The Solicitor General serves in the Justice Department, which is staffed by career attorneys who take constitutional oaths seriously and who will resign en masse rather than defend illegal orders. You're not commanding a military hierarchy, you're managing a professional class that has exit options. If you force them to choose between their law licenses and their jobs, they'll choose their licenses, and you'll wake up with a Justice Department that can't litigate. The recording captures a sound that audio forensic experts identify as a hand slapping a table, followed by the president's voice, the only time he speaks in the excerpt, saying 7 words. Then what exactly do we control anymore? The meeting continued for another 40 minutes after the recording cuts out, but subsequent leaked memos reveal the outcome: a decision to comply publicly with the court ruling while simultaneously pursuing a two-track strategy. Track one involves immediate drafting of emergency legislation that would provide explicit congressional authorization for tariffs, effectively mooting the court's non-delegation concerns by putting authority on clear statutory footing. Track 2 involves coordination with sympathetic senators to begin public discussion of court reform, not explicit court packing, but proposals for term limits, mandatory retirement ages, and jurisdictional restrictions that would signal to the court that its institutional prerogatives aren't invulnerable. This is compliance wrapped in threat, and it represents the evolution of constitutional hardball from hypothetical to operational doctrine. What's extraordinary about this recording isn't the disagreement. Every administration has policy disputes. What's extraordinary is that the disagreement reveals nobody in the room believes the system works anymore. The ideologue sees the court as an obstacle to be bypassed through executive assertion. The opportunist sees the court as a convenient excuse to abandon unpopular policy. The lawyers see the court as wielding institutional weapons that could destroy government functionality. Nobody sees the court as a legitimate co-equal branch whose rulings represent binding constitutional interpretation that responsible officials implement in good faith. The invisible architecture of constitutional governance depends on shared belief that the system has legitimacy even when it produces outcomes you oppose. That belief is gone, and once it's gone, every subsequent interaction becomes transactional rather than constitutional. Not what does the law require, but what can we get away with and who has leverage. If you're watching this and you want to understand how power actually operates, not the civics textbook version, not the news conference version, but the version that happens in dining rooms with voice recorders that weren't supposed to be on, subscribe now because this channel doesn't wait for official statements. We reconstruct decisions in real time using the documents, recordings, and communications that institutions spend millions trying to suppress. The next investigation is already being built from sources who understand that history is too important to leave to official narratives. Join the intelligence circle that sees the collapse coming before the markets price it in. The Supreme Court's ruling hit international diplomatic channels at 10:02 a.m., but the real global impact became visible at 2:47 p.m. when the International Monetary Fund's managing director released a statement that appeared measured in tone, but was seismic in implication. The IMF welcomes judicial clarity on trade authority, as predictable legal frameworks are essential for global economic stability. That single sentence, vetted by 14 country representatives before publication, was diplomatic code for something far more brutal. The world's financial institutions had just declared that the United States government's word on trade policy was no longer creditworthy without judicial pre-approval. Within 6 hours, 3 separate sovereign wealth funds, Norway's government pension fund, Singapore's GIC, and Abu Dhabi's ADIA, issued internal risk assessment updates reclassifying U.S. regulatory stability from Tier 1, predictable, to Tier 2, politically volatile, a designation previously reserved for emerging markets with unstable coalition governments. This reclassification triggers automatic portfolio rebalancing algorithms that over the next 90 days will shift an estimated $340 billion out of U.S. equities and into European and Asian alternatives. Not because America is in crisis today, but because the mathematical models now calculate that America might be in crisis tomorrow, and there's no institutional mechanism to predict or prevent it. Factor 1 is legal encirclement through standards arbitrage, and it's unfolding with surgical precision. Within 18 hours of the ruling, the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade circulated a confidential memo to member states outlining a new negotiating framework called Judicial Verification Protocols. The protocol requires that any future trade agreement with the United States include a clause allowing European companies to seek confirmation from U.S. federal courts that executive commitments have valid statutory authority before the agreement takes effect. This isn't a request for American legal opinions. It's a demand that U.S. courts pre-certify executive authority before Europe treats it as binding, effectively making the Supreme Court a party to every future trade negotiation. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry went further, releasing draft legislation that would require Japanese companies seeking government trade insurance to obtain legal opinions from U.S. constitutional scholars, confirming that any executive trade agreement falls within judicially recognized authority. What this means practically is that American presidents can no longer promise trade concessions or exemptions and have trading partners accept those promises at face value. Every commitment now requires legal authentication, turning trade diplomacy from a political process into a legalistic verification exercise. The encirclement is complete because even if Congress passes new trade authorization statutes, trading partners will demand multi-year track records proving courts accept the new framework before treating it as reliable. Factor 2 is institutional betrayal manifesting through professional exodus. Since the ruling, 17 senior officials across Commerce, Treasury, and the Office of the Trade Representative have submitted confidential resignation letters with deferred effective dates, meaning they're leaving, but not until they secure private sector positions, and they're using their remaining time in government to build relationships with the companies and law firms they'll be joining. This is the death spiral of institutional expertise. The people who know how to implement complex trade policy are evacuating because they've concluded that their work product will be invalidated by courts or weaponized by political opponents, making their expertise worthless. One particularly damaging resignation letter, leaked to Politico and authenticated by metadata forensics, came from a Commerce Department Deputy Assistant Secretary who'd served under 3 administrations. The letter's key paragraph, "I entered public service believing that policy expertise mattered and that well-designed programs could survive political transitions. The current environment has proven that assumption false. Technical competence is now subordinate to legal survivability, and I can no longer advise American businesses on regulatory compliance when I have no confidence that the regulations I'm explaining will exist in 6 months." That's not a policy disagreement. That's institutional collapse narrated by someone inside the collapse. Factor 3 is mathematical inevitability in refund cascades, and the numbers are catastrophic. Treasury's internal calculations, leaked via a memo that the Inspector General is now investigating, project that if even 40% of tariff-paying entities file for refunds under the theory that collections were legally void, the resulting liability is $50.8 billion plus compound interest calculated at federal judgment rates, which compounds to $63.4 billion over the 18-month collection period. But that's the conservative scenario. The memo's adverse scenario assumes 70% refund claims and includes consequential damages from companies that can prove they restructured supply chains or canceled contracts based on tariff costs they were legally compelled to pay. That scenario projects total liability of $127 billion, and the memo notes in footnote 41 that Treasury has no existing appropriation to cover refunds of that magnitude, meaning Congress would need to pass emergency supplemental funding, which would require congressional Republicans to vote for what Democrats would frame as bailing out corporations after an illegal tax scheme. The mathematical inevitability is this. Either Treasury negotiates settlement terms that pay pennies on the dollar, effectively admitting the collections were illegal but refusing full restitution, or Treasury litigates every refund claim, which costs more in legal fees than just paying the refunds, and creates years of uncertainty that paralyzes trade.